we all need a private space. We all need a backstage area, right? Where we can let down our hair and be our weird selves. Technologists do not want us to have those spaces because our weird selves are important information and data points for them to sell and to use.
Christine Rosen is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. She writes for Commentary Magazine and also co-hosts the Commentary Magazine podcast and is a fellow at the University of Virginia's Institute for Advanced Studies. Today we'll be discussing her latest book, The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World. Thank you for joining us today, Christine.
Well, thanks so much for having me on.
So in your book, you're talking about like tracking sensors and work. And in your book, you write that companies are using sensor technology to monitor employee wellness by tracking physical and emotional states, aiming to enhance mental well-being. And then you mentioned about this app called the Moody's app, which uses the built-in microphone on your computer or smartphone to analyze the full spectrum of human emotions based on its analysis of the tone and inflection of your voice. And then you mentioned later on, I think it was in like the reviews on the Google Play Store, that some person downloaded the app and then ran through a Hitler speech announcing the invasion of Poland, and the app interpreted Hitler. His mood apparently was friendly. That's how the app interpreted Hitler's speech of invasion. So do we really want to be outsourcing basic human skills to an app and to these companies and to these tech overlords, so to speak? Is that good for society?
No. Short answer, no. Longer answer, I think, though, that some of the ways, when you ask the question that way, I think most people would respond the same way, which is to say, of course not. A, they don't often work as they're advertised. But B, they are invasive and revealing of our internal compass, our emotions, our thoughts in a way that I think is quite disturbing when people think about it. However, that's not how the average employee who's being asked/told that they, or encouraged to wear these sensor technologies while in the office. They're being told, you know what, this is going to help make us all more productive. Your team will work better together when we have all this information gathered about how you all interact. It's good for wellness. So we're not just counting your steps. We're seeing how your blood pressure goes throughout the day. And all of this is so that you can be a better, healthier human being. Well, in fact, it's all redounds to the benefit of the employer and the people who produce the technology, because I think what we're missing there is the step and the question that should be asked first, which is this anybody's business? Is my emotional state right now anyone else's business but my own and my loved ones? And do we trust a technology and algorithms to actually understand our feelings better than we understand ourselves? Because I think a lot of people, when you ask them, what's the first place you go for information or question you have, they'll go to Google. So in a way, we're being asked to kind of trust a technology to process our own emotional experiences, assuming that it will be able to gather more information about us and understand us better than we understand ourselves. So both because of the privacy invasiveness of some of these new technologies and the way it encourages us not to trust our own judgment, I think they're very problematic.
You also, in this kind of same section of the book, you mention, what if you are married and then you kind of analyze your spouse's words and it's like, oh, your spouse is lying to you, they're nervous, their blood pressure went up. I think basically you say like, what if your wife tells you that she loves you, but then your smartphone registered her tone as nervous and possibly dishonest? And then it reminds me of back when I was younger and single, and then you meet these women and then they'll be like, oh, like my dog can always tell if this is like a good guy or a bad guy. And it's like your dog is basically like an infant and it's just reading your signals. If you don't like someone, your dog will then pick up on your cues and then project that onto the person. And if you like or you're attracted to someone and you think they'll be nice, your dog also responds to that. So your dog is just responding to you before you respond to the dog.
Right. Don't blame the dog.
Right. Right.
Well, this is one of those things, though, where in a way we've become habituated to trusting devices and algorithms and platforms that A, don't have our best interests in mind, and B, don't actually are a simulacrum of understanding. So information is not knowledge. So when we think about self-knowledge and we try to understand understand what motivates us to act as individuals. And if you study human beings more broadly, what motivates humans to do what humans do, we tend to self-deception is a real thing, right? I might tell myself I have all these wonderful qualities, but my best friend will be like, well, you're pretty impatient and you have a tendency to curse when you drive, all of which is true. So I might not want to think of myself that way, but my behavior demonstrates that. What I think we're doing with a lot of these technologies is because we know we are prone to self-deception, we think we want brutal honesty in the form of constant observation and surveillance by a supposedly neutral device or tool. But these devices are never neutral. Technology is never neutral. It is ambivalent. And so it depends on how we deploy these powers. And my concern throughout writing this book is trying to find places in our human interactions where we need to say no to that sort of observation by technology. We've embraced it in a lot of areas of life that I think unthinkingly we've given up a bit of our privacy. And I do think, look, we all need a private space. We all need a backstage area, right, where we can let down our hair and be our weird selves. Technologists do not want us to have those spaces because our weird selves are important information and data points for them to sell and to use. So we have to now defend those human spaces and say no to having them be observed, turned into information, sold to the highest bidder, et cetera, et cetera.
To me, the work part is more insidious or sinister than other people. If you choose to use the phone to watch movies or be on social media, at least that's what you choose to do. But the reason I really kind of focused or like this chapter was my favorite was because the employees don't have options. Like you go to work and you're basically like, hey, you have to use this, right? Like you have to use this technology. I had a podcast with a professor at Northwestern University who's studying freelance apps and the way that they rate you and things like that to kind of control your behavior. And then it's like the whole Goodhart's law where basically a measure ceases to be a measure once you optimize for it. So if you're going to have these employees wearing apps and it's like, okay, like people are going to get promoted based on people that have good vibes, whatever that means, then people will probably blow off work, blow off things that are stressful because now you're going to be less stressed out. So then you're getting promoted because like this person's like really, he's chill. He's got good vibes the whole day. I say, well, yeah, but Bob doesn't do anything all day. But yeah, but he's got, he's got the best rating on Moody's app or whatever. It just seems like maybe we should just take a step back and actually use our human brain. I guess that seems like it's a big mind blowing to people. Like, oh, I had to use my brain for once. Damn.
Well, but there is something really convenient if you're the employer, right? Because what you're doing by using these technologies is outsourcing difficult value judgments you're supposed to make. What are the values of your business? What will you and won't you do to pursue efficiency and a bottom line? So you'll see, there are companies that are run more ethically that sit down and talk about their values and then try to put them into practice, and they treat their employees according to those values. Then there's everybody else who it's much easier to say, oh, well, we value all these things. Obviously, we care about your wellness. Anytime you hear the word wellness come out of your employer's mouth, like run as fast as you can. But under this sort of hazy cloak of wellness, there's a lot of control choices being ceded to the employer. And as you say, I think especially if you're a young employee with not a lot of seniority and not a lot of power and you want to work your way up, you're going to concede to do all of this. Just like we know long haul truckers for many companies are now wearing hats that have sensors embedded, all in the idea of safety and preventing risk to monitor stuff that actually can tell them a lot more than whether they're just getting sleepy, can monitor obviously any substances they might be taking and whatnot. And again, you can weigh that safety versus privacy infringement risk. And if you're the truck driver, maybe make your own choice. But if you're a low-level employee with very little power and a lot of supervision, it's harder to say no to these things. And so then the company culture becomes one of surveillance. All, again, not described as surveillance, but as team building and better communication. And, if we have all this data, we'll actually see who gets along with whom and how to make better teams. And it's not entirely false. I mean, that the data does help managers understand their teams better. But my question is always at what cost? My question is always what's not on the menu for the employee? What are they not being offered? Are they being offered a way to opt out of these things? Are they being punished if they don't opt in? You'll get a lower health insurance rate at many companies now if you wear the pedometer. And I feel that seems like very mild coerciveness. But if you have a very tight budget every month and that $50 difference is the difference between you being able to pay for your, gas bill or not, then you're obviously going to opt into the surveillance. So I feel like, again, these are moral and ethical questions. And when we outsource them to technology, it lets other humans off the hook from taking responsibility for those ethical decisions.
You kind of talked in the book about the terms of service. You agree to these terms of service. And let's just say you install an app on your phone for work. And then all of a sudden now they give that information away to some third party. And we've seen how like car insurance companies will use this information, or some states, I think some states it's illegal, other states it's not, where you can then impact the price of their car insurance because it's like, well, Bob likes to speed and Bob,
stays out late.
Bob's staying out late. It looks like he's parked outside of a bar quite often. We wonder what he's doing there. He's gone through a few yellow lights. But of course, you don't even know this because you're just giving away this information that, maybe an app that you have to have for work. All of a sudden now they're selling this information, or you're on whatever. It doesn't matter what app. I mean, you're all kind of just giving away your rights to third parties.
Well, then you also, as an employer or a manager, what you're missing is once employees understand they're being surveyed, and we know this from decades of sociological research, once you know you're being watched, you do behave differently. Just like once you know that everybody might yell and scream at you for saying the wrong thing, you're going to start self-censoring your speech in groups where you're worried about being ostracized for things you believe. So I feel like in the interest of making employees feel more comfortable and all the, healthy and engaged with their work, there's actually a counterintuitive impact on the employee when they think about, am I being watched? Am I allowed to do this? They might actually engage in behavior that's meant to cover their private lives up a little more. And they might then also not be willing to come to a manager and say, I'm having this problem at home and I need a little break from work here. And because all of that's going to go into a file. We see this in education policy too, where parents are worried about the stuff that gets, in ed tech, what's in their kids' file, which might track them forever. So again, it's thinking through the unintended consequences of often perfectly legitimate tools that employers and others embrace to make things more efficient, more convenient. But again, what we decide to turn into information and data for others to use is now deeply, deeply implicated in our private choices and our private lives and eventually our thoughts. Like it's going to be the kind of thing where, privacy, as we used to talk about it in the old days, no longer exists. And if you listen to the rhetoric of a lot of big tech company CEOs, they're very enthusiastic about that. It's like, privacy, who needs that anymore? Well, we do, because we're humans and we're weird and we're quirky and we're contradictory, and we need to have things that are kept from public view. That's part of being a healthy, well-rounded person, is that you have a public and a private space. And we are eroding those private spaces every day.
One of the themes of your book is basically that these tech companies know you better than you know yourself. And you even have a quote with Eric Schmidt at the time he was the CEO of Google. But basically, it's like now everything's connected. You have these smart devices. So you have your smart refrigerator, your smartphone, the whole Internet of Things, which again is just a bullshit word to say that it's, connected to the internet. But like they're literally like, as soon as your milk, this person uses a bunch of coffee cream, their coffee cream's running low. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden now you're getting all these alerts. Maybe you're on your Google Maps and then it's trying to reroute you to a grocery store to pick up your coffee cream or whatever. And then he's basically Eric Schmidt's like, oh yeah, like we're doing good. Like we're just like helping you out. Who are you really helping out?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think a lot of the concern in the early days of mobile technology and the internet was just that. Like we're going to get sold a bill of goods. We're going to get advertisements, targeting us all the time, and that's going to be oppressive. And nobody wants that. And it's true. I think nobody wants that. However, I think what's different now is that we've become, again, I keep using the word habituated, but our behavior is habit, and we've become habituated to that sort of bombardment of targeted advertisements and targeted content all the time now. The difference now is that we're starting to trust it more than we trust our own judgment. So one of the examples I had in the book was a young woman who was spending a lot of time on TikTok, and TikTok started serving her up content that was like targeted for people who are bisexual. And she's like, well, this is weird because I'm not bisexual. The more she watched the content, she's like, actually, I think I'm bisexual. TikTok knew before I did. Now, that is a deeply, deeply personal matter. Your sexuality is a deeply personal matter. She was actually at first surprised, but then sort of relieved to think that, this algorithm, so sophisticated, has monitored my consumption habits in such a granular way that it knows I'm bisexual before I do. And now it's like it saw into my soul, is what she said. That should worry us, because that is not what it's designed to do. And that is, it doesn't care about your soul. The people who run TikTok don't care about the state of your soul. They don't care about you at all, except as an entity for whom they can advertise and hoover up your information and send back to, well, in this case, communist China until we pass legislation. But the point is that we have come to trust the assessments. I won't say judgment. Judgment is a human thing. The assessments of these tools in a way that worries me going forward, because at the same time, if I've read a lot of the stuff that the technologists who design these things say, they want us to mistrust human judgment. Now, human judgment is a flawed thing, but that's why we have politics. That's why we have civic engagement. We have ways of working out our disagreements and our understanding of a problem. Now, it's very easy to live in your own reality and never have to encounter or deal with anyone else's reality unless you want to. And that worries me for civic health. It worries me for our politics. It worries me on a number of levels. But the idea that we should trust the information given back to us by an algorithm versus the judgment of our fellow human beings, that's going to lead us to a bad place in some parts of life.
When I was reading that section talking about the bisexual, my first thought when I was reading that was maybe it's just a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like they've identified a person that might be easily persuadable, and because like you mentioned, all these tech platforms, they run these tests all the time. I mean, they use humans as an experiment. It's not even A/B, it's like ABCD, right? They're running all sorts of different things. But I was like, I wonder if it was just a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It might have been. It was her human need to feel like that something outside of her understood her better than she understood herself that worried me, though. I think we should trust our own judgment a little better. But that, again, that's something we have to practice. It's an old-fashioned word, but virtues have a meaning, and they come out of character formation, habit. The way we choose to live forms our habit, our habits, our character. And when we think about shared virtues we want to have, like being able to get along in public space with our fellow human beings without losing it and screaming and going into, fits or causing accidents through road rage. These are human skills that are deteriorating. And again, the evidence, a lot of it's qualitative, a lot of it seems anecdotal, but talk to anyone about what it's like to walk through public space nowadays versus even 10 or 20 years ago. They will tell you they notice a difference in how people interact and whether they look each other in the eye, and whether if someone's in trouble, people will rush to their aid. Now, I will say on that, most people will still do the right thing. People are I still believe, genuinely decent. But they have to go against what the phone they're holding encourages them to do, which is to step back, not get involved, and film it and upload it to like WorldStar or one of the other sites where people show fighting and other things.
Yeah, what you're saying, it kind of reminds me of like these apps when it tells you like you're thirsty. Like, okay, yeah, like my app knows better. And I got a master's in exercise and science, and I did a lot of research on marathon running and hydration levels. And more people die in marathons from being overhydrated than being underhydrated, because it's like people are constantly told like, hey, like, if you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated.
Right.
So drink, even if you're not thirsty, drink. And the marathon is, it's 26 miles, right? If you're not running very fast and you're just constantly chugging water over 26 miles. And when this first started happening, people would pass out. And what was the first reaction? Like, oh, they're dehydrated. They're running. Right. So then they hit them with, with like saline or whatever, and they die. So now they've recognized that, like, oh, hey, this person's probably just, kind of a slow fat ass, and they're probably overhydrated. But it's like when they have goals,
right? They're trying to meet those goals,
right? They do have goals, right? But the point is like, if you tell people like, hey, like, these certain things, like, hey, like, even if you're not thirsty, just drink. But then when you add the authority of the app, and people are like, oh my God, like, this app is so advanced, people will go against their base human instinct all the time if either an authority figure or if an app, and that app, like, I think he probably even has more in their mind authority than even a person would have.
Well, and it does something else that humans aren't always good at doing, which is it rewards you immediately, right? So the intermittent reward system that's designed, particularly into social media platforms, but really to all of these technologies. I mean, even if you're old school and are getting, the ping from your old school email account, as some of us who are a certain age do, that's still a reward. The brain goes, somebody wants to reach me. And, 9 times out of 10, it's spam or something not useful, but all you know is that you got a reward for being openly available at any time for that little intermittent ping. And I know, there's a lot of discussion about, are these technologies addictive? What dopamine, et cetera, et cetera. Interesting debates that go on about addiction in that regard. But there's a wonderful book, which I cite in the research, about machine gambling. That's been a couple scholars who have looked at that. And the design of the machine itself is entirely focused on rewarding the most sort of lizard part of your brain, right? The thing that just says, I want that reward, and I don't need to know when it's going to come. I will keep waiting for that reward. It's a form of operant conditioning, right? We are conditioning ourselves to expect certain things. So then you transfer that to the real world where you don't get rewarded all the time. In fact, people can be rude and awful even when they should say thank you and please, or where you're not used to waiting. I'm used to getting everything on my phone right away. So then when you're forced into situations where you have to practice patience, you're out of practice. And we see the results of that all the time.
You didn't talk about this in the book, but I actually kind of just had this moment when I was remembering back to an interview that Steve Jobs did shortly after the iPad came out. The interviewer asked him what his kids thought about the iPad. And basically, Steve Jobs this is 2 years after, and he said that we actually don't allow our kids to use the iPad. They think it's too dangerous for them. Bill Gates, in an interview when his kids were younger, he said that he didn't allow his kids to have a cell phone until they were 14 years of age. And Chamath, who's an ex-Facebook executive, he was like the guy that really was in charge of user engagement, which is a polite way to say, let's get these people addicted, right? But he, in a 2020 interview, when he was talking about social media, he says basically that he doesn't use this shit. This is what he says, quote, and then his kids are also not allowed to use this shit. Again, he's using the word shit, which I think tells you quite a bit. I've seen in interviews where Mark Zuckerberg basically says that, he doesn't really say it. I think he's smart enough, but he kind of alludes to the fact that his kids have very minimal. They're allowed to use these technologies very minimally. So what does that say when the CEOs, the creators of these technologies, don't even allow their own family members to use them, their kids, and in some cases, they don't even allow them themselves to use them?
Yes, if they're not getting high on their own supply, then probably you shouldn't be either. And I think it's really, really, my sister lives in Silicon Valley, and you know what the most popular schools are there? Waldorf and Montessori schools, very low-tech or no-tech schools, places where kids learn the old-fashioned way, if you will, hands-on, a lot of free play, open play, very, very few or no screens. And yes, I think it's incredibly revealing that the people who make this stuff don't let their own children use it. I mean, they might use it themselves for work and whatnot, but it goes beyond hypocrisy. Actually, it's very much, it reminds me of all the celebrities who have cosmetics lines. And, if you buy their cosmetics at the CVS, it's really crap. And, it's probably all packed full of chemicals. And, they're not slapping that stuff on their face every night. They're buying the high end, expensive things that are all, made from, only organic, this and that. So that behavior matters. And I think especially if you start looking at who are the children in this country who spend most of their time staring at screens, lower socioeconomic class children. And that should worry us for a number of reasons. One, because we were sold this bill of goods 10 or 15 years ago about the digital divide. We need to wire up every household because poor kids will fall behind if they don't have the internet. Okay, well, so now everybody has the internet. Guess what? It's being used as an entertainment and babysitter for kids who most need that human interaction, who need one-on-one, who need to be reading and doing stuff that's more traditional literacy building activities. And they're not getting it. Sometimes it's because they live in an unsafe neighborhood and staying at home playing video games is the safest activity for them. But it's also that it's easy, it's cheap, and their schools are giving it to them from the moment they're kindergartners. Everything about the culture rewards that. So they are not learning those basic life skills, delayed gratification, patience, being able to sift through a lot of information and understand what's real, what's not, to know when you're being manipulated. And that is, I think, more worrisome because those are kids who are coming from environments where they already have a lot of challenges thrown at them. So to pacify them with technology is actually, if you dig down in the rhetoric of some of these tech CEOs, you'll see that. It's like, oh, well, let's just keep them all, let's give them their soma and they'll stay quiet and the rest of us will live our very nice lives. Mark Andreessen has even coined a phrase called reality privilege, where he says it's a privilege to have a nice reality. So if you can't have that, let's give you virtual reality or games or things that'll distract you from your reality. I think that's dystopian, and I think we shouldn't embrace that as a way for anyone to live, least of all the people who are most vulnerable in our society.
You mentioned Mark Andreessen. You mentioned him, so I'll mention him as well. But you mentioned him multiple times in your book. And for those that don't know, Mark Andreessen is a venture capitalist. He also was the creator of Mosaic, which was basically the first web browser. And then, of course, he created that when he was in university. So then he had to, come up with a new plan so he could monetize it, which came up with Netscape Navigator. Sold that for a bunch of money, became a VC, which seems pretty common. And then I also mentioned Chamath earlier, who's also a venture capitalist. And in 2016, there was an article where Mark Andreessen was enjoying a social media vacation. And but it seems like, you mentioned about how Andreessen is talking about this digital privilege. But these VCs, they're always jumping on the next big thing, right? They always have to have the next hype cycle. I mean, before a while, it was NFTs, it was crypto.
Now it's everything AI.
Right, and now everything's AI. But if we kind of just were to take what Steve Jobs said over a decade ago before he passed away, where he's not letting his kids use an iPad, do you think Steve Jobs would let his kids use some VR goggle headset? I mean, hell no, right? I mean, if he was mad about an iPad, he would certainly be like, yeah, I don't know, like, absolutely not. But like I said, I was actually trying to figure out if Mark Andreessen had kids and whether or not he let them use technology. I couldn't find anything, but they're just like shoving this shit down your throat because they're making money, right? They don't actually believe.
Right. Well, it's interesting to me because I think there is a whole what they're also doing is starting to describe a future that worries me a lot, because it's one where human interaction becomes a luxury good that only the wealthy can afford, right? You get the human coming in and giving you therapy. The rest of us get like the chatbot wobot to we get an AI fueled chatbot to tell us to stop worrying about so many things. They get and Andreessen is part of this group that is buying up private land in California to make their own separate city, because obviously San Francisco is a mess. So let's go build our own perfect, utopia. And as you can imagine, there will certainly be an economic barrier to entry for that city. So there are, and again, they'll call it a smart city. They'll say it's more efficient, all these other things. But that is a kind of two-tier society that is antithetical to democratic principles. So I am not against entrepreneurship. I think Andreessen and others are quite creative. Where I get off the train is when the argument is that these things that they are creating, which we now know to have negative consequences for their users, those have to be reckoned with. And then going forward, you don't promise people a bill of goods and then give them something that's poisonous. And we're seeing this with kids now. People are finally recognizing that raising entire generation on social media platforms has not been great for their mental health. Now, some kids are fine, but a lot of kids are expressing anxiety. The most interesting research is when you poll younger kids and ask them, do you wish this stuff had never been invented? The majority say, yeah, we wish this had never been invented. That tells you something about how they understand their own use of this. So when the big tech guys are saying this is going to make life better, more seamless, more efficient, you'll have more options, more choices, I tell my students this. I'm like, what's not on the menu of choices? They're giving you a menu claiming you have choice, but you know what? There are 10 other things on there that you have the right to that they're not offering. So think about what's not on the menu when you're offered these perfect choices through your technology, because they, as you say, they have the bottom line in mind. Their businesses, their companies, but you should understand what motivates them and separate it from their PR and marketing. And here in DC, their lobbying capability, which is vast.
I was watching an interview, I think was it you and Megyn Kelly, and I think he said that you have two college age boys,
twin boys
right,
who are freshmen in college. Yeah.
Right. So I mean, you actually have some firsthand experience having kids of the Gen Z age. Like when you were raising them, did you have to kick them off the phone or kick them off other forms of technology? What was your personal experience with this?
So I was pretty draconian. They had no screens 0 to 5, no TV, no movies, nothing 0 to 5. And the burden is on the parents. If you make that choice, it's much harder for you. I can tell you, it's just harder because you got to monitor their activities. You got to give them stuff to do. So when they got older, they were the last kid. They got smartphone in high school. They were ninth graders when they got there. And I believe me, they complained. They were the last kids in their class to get phones. Flash forward a few years, they'll now say, you know what, it's good that we didn't have it. We didn't need it. Would have gotten into trouble with it. Now they're boys, so they were never all that interested in social media. They are on Instagram because their friends are on it. But they don't really organize as much their social life through Instagram in the way that their female friends do, right? It's a different experience for girls and boys at that age. So they had some built-in mechanisms there, and they knew the first thing to go if they weren't getting their schoolwork done, doing all their chores, all that stuff, was the phone. Because as I always told them, I'm like, and they had to sign a contract when they got a phone. It's my phone. I pay for it. So if you're not doing what you need to, I will take this thing that I own because it's paid for by me, and you'll get it back when you get your other stuff done. I didn't have to do that often. They on their own would take hiatuses from social media when they found themselves. It was the reels and the YouTube shorts where they keep popping up, and they said, oh my God, I just wasted 30 minutes looking at stuff and I don't remember any of it. I'm like, yeah, that's what it's designed to do. So once they became older, I wasn't like, scolding them all the time like a Luddite, because, I want them to internalize that and to set their own limits, which they did. One of them to the point that he went this past summer to Wyoming in the middle of nowhere with a small group and had no phone. They had a sat phone in case there was a bear attack, but there was zero communication in some of the most remote areas of the country. And he came back and he's like, the phone is just useless. Like, it is a drain on attention. He understood that because he had taken this break, a very extreme break from it. So they are definitely unusual in their peer group. I would have probably been more heavy-handed with the rules if they had been girls. I mean, sorry, Mother Nature is not a feminist. Like, girls have different experiences with this stuff. They mature different ways and socialize differently through the technology in ways that I think are much more potentially harmful as teenagers than the boys. There are risks for boys that come at different ages than girls. Was I 100% perfect in keeping dangerous stuff away from them? Of course not, because it's all there. But my goal as a parent was to really help them understand and have awareness when they were using it. I would sometimes be like, I'm not going to take your phone away, especially when they were, 18. I'm not taking their phone away. I would say, set a timer, because I'd say, you've been on Instagram Reels a lot. Set a timer. And they would say, no, I'm not. And when they'd set the timer, they would realize, wow, I'm wasting time.
You mentioned you got boys and that you'd be a lot more hardcore if they were females. Why is that the case?
So I think if you look at how there's interesting research now for adolescents in particular, John Haidt has this in his new book, The Anxious Generation, because of the way that girls socialize in their teen years, and the fact that most of that socialization is now happening on platforms like Instagram, which are very visually based and very much focused on looking perfect and having perfect physical presentation. And the ability on those platforms to name and shame people constantly and to see where you rank status-wise, it makes it a more dangerous environment for young women in the sense that everything happens there. There's very little accountability when people gang up on each other. It all happens, under the radar of parents, because none of them are doing this on their regular Instagram accounts. They all have fake Instagram accounts, and that's where they all bully each other in terrible ways. But the emotional lives of these girls are enmeshed in larger groups in a way that for the boys is just different in my experience and in what some of the social science research shows. So it's not that there aren't dangers for boys. There are, but they come a little bit older than the girls. And the other thing is these girls, none of these young people should be on these platforms. These were designed for adults. And when you have a 9 or a 10-year-old on Instagram watching stuff about what she should look like, and she hasn't even gone through puberty, her understanding of what a grown woman's body should look like is completely skewed by the time she herself starts undergoing the changes of puberty. And I think you see a lot of confusion and anger and anxiety about that because of these misperceptions, because they've spent so much of their time. I mean, 7 hours a day is the average for screen time for adults in this country. It's much, much higher for kids. And most of that's happening on social media platforms. So that's where we just know developmentally and emotionally there are differences and different risks for girls than boys in adolescence when they're online.
What's the most outrageous story when you were researching this book? I was kind of looking back to when you're talking about, being in a museum where all of a sudden now this museum's more of a quote unquote interactive experience, or when traveling. Like I lived abroad for years, and it's like I see people nowadays, you land at an airport and you get a phone, put a SIM card in there, and then the first thing you do is Uber from the airport to the hostel or the hotel, whatever. And you mentioned in the book, I mean, that's not called traveling, that's called tourism.
Right.
Right. Of course,
Exactly.
These people will never tell you that. They'll just say it's, they're backpackers or whatever. And we're like, whatever. Those are just kind of a couple of examples that I thought. But as the person that actually wrote this book, what were some of the most outrageous things that you saw?
It's funny because that travel stuff came from the chapter on mediating our pleasures. And I will say, I grew up, I was in the marching band. I can confess that, because the internet didn't exist, so no one will find the pictures. But I played the bassoon and I was like a musician. So I saw a lot. I have friends who were like cool musicians. They played jazz stuff and everything. So I would go see a lot of live music. When I was a young adult, I still try to go see live music as often as possible. And going to concerts now and just a sea of glowing cell phone screens is between you and the person on stage. Now, not in classical music concerts, obviously, but in a number of other concerts, you'll see that. And that's a different experience. And people are not actually just in the moment. And so I've been recently to a few concerts where you're required to put your cell phone in one of those little wander bags and it gets locked up and you get it back at the end of the concert. It's so much better. And it's hard to describe. Again, these are qualitatively different experiences, not quantitatively different ones. So you end up talking to the people around you. You end up interacting as a group, a concert-going group, in a way that you don't when everybody's got their phone and is easily distracted and taking pictures of the concert. And you remember that experience differently. We do know that from memory research, which shows us that if you take a picture of something, you're less likely to remember it than if you sit and look at it. This is true of art as well. So going to museums now and just seeing people snap pictures and move along and not just sit and submit yourself to the artist's vision. That's what art is for. It's supposed to humble us. We're supposed to look at a painting or listen to a great musician and be like, wow, it is amazing what this person has created. And we should respect that. And I feel like we're not treating with enough awe and respect that kind of talent that really is the basis for human culture and human civilization. And we think we're capturing it on our phones, but what we're really doing is not experiencing it in real time. And so I worry about the degradation of that, particularly because I'm a humanities person, for humanities and the arts. Because you know what? It's a struggle to get through some great literature, but it's worth it. And it's worth it because it forces you to slow down and try to understand what the writer is saying, or try to understand what that artist is trying to show you. And that's important. I think it's important for us to do that.
You mentioned taking a phone and putting it in a locker. My wife and I were invited by one of her coworkers to a waterfall and dinner, and her coworker is like in his low 20s, and we went with a bunch of his friends who are also in their low 20s. And then my fiance and I are in our 40s. So we are obviously the oldest people there. And after the waterfall, we go to this restaurant, everything's, farm to table, all this stuff. And so her coworker was like, hey guys, let's put all of our, cell phones in a pile on the table. And the first person to touch their cell phone pays the bill.
Yes. I love that game.
Right.
This is good, but yeah.
Yeah, and I was just kind of like, my wife, of course, was the first person to touch a phone, and she's like,
"Oh no!"
She was the one in the 40s. But to me, it seemed like, and I was like, kind of, like taken aback. But I was like, "Is this like common?" They're like, "Oh yeah," and it's just, but they're used to like having to put their phone before they go to a class, before they have an activity, they collect the phones, and people always kind of like bash the young people for being on their phone, but like the grandma who's always on her iPad or whatever is maybe even more guilty of it. When this technology first came out, people didn't know how to handle it, TV or radio, whatever, and then people figure out a way that they can manage it, etc. And I was actually kind of like shocked that the younger people were on their phones less than some of the older people. Do you think that we will see like this rebalancing?
I hope so. I will say the difference between smartphones in particular as a technology and all the stuff that came before TV, even desktop computing with the internet, I would put as separate from mobile technology. The amount of time we've had to adjust is just a few years. So when radio first came on, when landline telephones first came into sort of use, it took decades for most Americans to have those technologies in their private home. So the two differences with the mobile device is that first, it's happened very quickly. So our old-fashioned, evolutionarily slowly developed brains are having a really hard time understanding the new norms of how to use this, which is typical of new technologies. But the other thing is it goes everywhere. It's on our body. It's not at work or at home. It's not, it's everywhere all the time. It is for many people the first thing they reach for in the morning and the last thing they touch at night. And that is a hugely transformative thing if you think about the power, particularly as sensors and other things that can measure your physiological reactions, not just what you text to your friends. That is a transformative technology. And we know from what a lot of these companies have applied for patent-wise, that they don't just want to have you wear, what's the meta thing is new Ray-Bans that have an overlay, screen overlay. They want sensors that you can have embedded on your body that will do a lot of these things for you so you don't even have to carry a phone. That is a new kind of human experience. It is one that is constantly mediating and giving off information about you to a whole host of others, most of whom you won't even know or have agreed to have that information. So in that sense, I think it's great when people try to find these ways of coping, particularly in social situations of like putting your phones down, all these rules that, but what that also shows me, and this is where I become a little more pessimistic, is that we have to actively defend those human spaces from mediation all the time now. We cannot take for granted that there won't be a device there. And it only really takes one person on their device to disrupt a whole social interaction. We've all had that experience too. So in that sense, it's really a test of our willpower, and humans have a lot of willpower. We can be quite disciplined, but that's tough. That's tough for people to do day in and day out. And, when you're tired and bored and you just want to, play Candy Crush on your phone instead of like daydream while you wait for the bus. But our brains do need that fallow time. And I feel like technologists want to colonize every single minute and get every single piece of information about us all the time. And that is new. That's new.
Kind of speaking about rebalancing, I was reading this study from a few days ago that said that Gen Zs are getting canned, getting fired from their jobs. A recent survey found that many companies are reluctant to hire Gen Z graduates due to concerns about their motivation, readiness, soft skills, and communication, and that Gen Z struggles with adapting to less structured, autonomous work environments. And it says that 60% of employers have been firing recent Gen Z hires in 2024. And to me, it's the whole, like, what's the whole quote, like you're a liberal when you're young, and then as soon as you start paying taxes, you kind of become like a fiscal conservative. But it's like, if you have everything structured and you get these trophies and you're spending all this time online, as soon as you get a real job, that shit just does not fly. Right. Like you're gonna have, like, it's like people, you should just like retrain these people. Like, you know what? Employers don't have time for that because they can find someone that's already has the acumen to do the job. So at this point, we're not hand-holding anymore. Like, the hand-holding is done. Like,
yeah. Well, but do you remember a few years ago, it's probably almost 10 years ago now, I think it was at NYU or CUNY, one of the, a school in New York, decided to have a class for freshmen, and it was a soft skills class, basically. They didn't call it that, but they were all required to take it. They put them all in a room together, and they said, turn to the person next to you, introduce yourself, and start a conversation. And a lot of them couldn't do it. And so the class was basically, we're going to teach you how to just interact with other people who you don't know. And I remember everybody going, oh, this is so silly. Of course, kids know how to do this. It's no problem. My kids are not like that. I remember all the reaction to that. Well, fast forward in a decade, it's more of a problem, not less. And that's because, and the honest Gen Zers, so not just my sons, but their friends and my niece. I mean, I know a lot of Gen Z kids. They're great as a generation. Actually, they're very idealistic. They have a healthy skepticism about a lot of things that I think is good for our country. But they'll tell you, they don't like having to talk to other people. They don't even like to make phone calls. Like, it's just easier. They grew up with the ease of a style of communication that means when they get into a public facing job, or even a job where they have to talk to their colleagues, they don't know how to do it. And it's scary. I mean, it does actually cause anxiety for them. So yeah, the soft skills matter. I've heard multiple stories from employers about, especially employers who are hiring people in consulting gigs or legal gigs, where they're actually required, the employees have to understand what makes people tick in order to do their jobs, and they just don't have those skills. So it's it is a problem. And I think we can retrain some of it, but it's going to have to start with us recognizing, which we're just now doing, that a lot of that begins because they're not having those face-to-face interactions when they're very, very young, which is when you learn how to read other people's feelings and emotions, how you learn to assess their movements as like, oh, hey, nice to see you, or, what hand gestures mean, all those unspoken rules and the unspoken language that we all speak with our physical bodies, because they can spend a lot of their time, even as children, on a screen, not actually interacting with the world as embodied humans.
It wasn't too long ago where people would be like, if you want to get a job, make a bunch of money, just learn to code. And then, of course, now with like AI and like
AI is coding. Yeah.
Right. AI is coding. These tech companies are laying people off. Maybe the future would be like, hey, just learn to talk. Like learn to have a normal...
Look someone in the eye.
Right. Like just learn to have eye contact. Like that's how you get a job. We're kind of joking about this, but I think like there is some reality. Like you think you have these skills and then no one's going to hire you, or you get hired and then you lose the job and you're out of the parents' nest. You got to figure this shit out. Else you're going to be on the unemployment line, and no one wants that.
Well, and then it's incumbent on the oldsters, you're younger than I am, but my generation in particular, those of us who didn't grow up with this stuff, we're the hybrids. We learned as adults. We think we know it all, and yet we're deeply cynical because we're Gen X, the best, and nobody recognizes our greatness. But when we are in public space, as you said earlier, we're often the worst offenders here because we think we've understood the balance. But in truth, I've many times watched at a local coffee shop, people come in, they've ordered something on an app, they walk over, the nice lady behind the counter is like, here you go, smiling, making eye contact. They pick it up. They don't even acknowledge she's right there. That is dehumanizing. And it's a very tiny moment of dehumanization. But if it happens throughout the day, all day, every day, and we're doing this to each other, it changes how we feel about each other. So then when we actually do disagree on important matters, we have a harder time coming to some sort of compromise or even having a negotiation because everybody's on high alert and doesn't know how to read each other and interact with each other. And we're used to having all of our fights online where there's no accountability and we can be anonymous and scream and yell. And I think, again, it's habits of mind and habits of behavior that are undermining a lot of the things that as humans, we used to do pretty well. Not always, but we have to find ways to get along because we don't have to agree with each other, but we have to find ways to get along even as we live in disagreement.
You always hear about how these younger people are like really tech savvy because they grew up with technology. And we had David Sachs on, and not that David Sachs is on the LM podcast. The other David Sachs, he wrote a book on, I forget the name of it. It was something about like how we're going back to analog. He has kids, but he's like, just because you're on your phone 24/7 doesn't mean you're tech savvy. You're just like you're on TikTok or you're like playing Candy Crush or whatever. So you're not actually tech savvy. And my fiance manages quite a few people that are in their 20s, and she's like shocked. She's having them do an Excel spreadsheet and they don't even know how to like add another page. They don't even know what a macro is, they're just using the stupid apps on the cell phone. These people are just like, they're so de-skilled.
Well, one of the scarier stories I encountered came too late for me to put it in the book. But it is indicative of some of the concerns you're raising. And it was a woman who was working with her daughter on her spelling lesson. And she was trying to like teach her how to figure out how to spell a word. And the girl was getting exasperated with her mother and said, I don't have to learn how to spell. And she's like, yeah, well, everybody has to learn how to spell. She said, no, look. And so she went to the Google prompt and she started to type the word that she was supposed to learn how to spell. And it popped up for her. She's like, see, like, if I'm not sure, I'll just do it this way. And actually our far too much of our educational system encourages that way thinking. I had a really long argument with a parent who was very pro AI, very pro ChatGPT. I'm like, well, that's fine. I can understand there are situations like if you're a small business owner and you're not a professional writer and you need to have some ad copy, ChatGPT will do that for you, and that's a convenience. You don't have to hire someone to do that. You can just crank it out. But he was arguing that it made his son a better writer. He was saying, oh, he gets the prompts. And then I said, well, your son is becoming an editor. He's not becoming a writer. A writer starts with a blank page. You're giving him all of this material and then he's manipulating it and editing it, which is another skill set, but it's not writing. And he didn't understand the difference. And I worry that an entire generation that thinks spelling means typing into Google to have the word finished for you or auto-completed when you're texting, or that writing is the same as, having ChatGPT give you a term paper and you just fiddle around with the details. These are different things and we have to maintain the distinctions. And that's where I do become kind of old school finger wagging, almost neo-Victorian. I'm like, these things, we have over time understood these things matter. Reason we teach handwriting is that it slows down a kid's thoughts and slows down their mind and body at the same time and forces them to process letters in a way that later helps them become better readers and analyze text, and it helps with memory. So we did all this stuff and continue to do it because it served a purpose. I think nowadays we're too quick to discard the old, always assuming the new is better. And I would argue in a lot of these situations, we now have evidence that the new thing wasn't the better thing. So we need to recover and reclaim some of the experiences and behaviors and habits of mind that we know have worked for centuries.
You mentioned in the book talking about like these simulation programs at like universities, talking about nursing school. Like a nursing school, they might not even actually come into contact with a real patient. They're just working on a hairless mannequin, as you talk about. Then, of course, the hairless mannequin is not screaming or crying or having real issues, not to mention how many people are a hairless mannequin.
Yes, very few. No, well, and that, again, that's a kind of thing where, especially if you deal with other human beings, you need to know the range of human behavior. And if you're a nurse, you also have to have empathy. And so you are seeing, if all of your experiments are on a model, and I think models can be useful, these sort of mannequin type things, you can practice, getting a vein on someone's arm without stabbing someone a million times. But when it comes to actually dealing with patients, which is the job of nurses, you're going to be dealing with a lot of difficult people who are in pain, who are scared, who are anxious. And part of your job is managing that, not just managing to put a needle in a vein. And I think, again, the sort of efficiency and the cost-cutting availability of some of these tools when we're training people whose first and most important role is to connect with their patients. It's worrisome. I think it's true for doctors too. When we automated all the medical records, it was supposed to make their job easier. But now if you go to your doctor, he or she will spend most of their time staring at the computer screen, entering all the data while you tell them your symptoms instead of looking at you as a patient. That's again, a qualitative difference. Does that make them a better doctor? I'm not so sure. In your last chapter, you kind of talked about some of the solutions, and then you basically say, like, you don't really think there's too many solutions, mostly because this stuff is just so ubiquitous. We started the podcast. If you're an employee, it's not like you have an option unless you want to quit the job. But what are some of the solutions? And then secondly, also, where is this personal responsibility? I saw a congressional hearing, it was like a year ago, whatever, it was Mark Zuckerberg, and he's getting blamed for all this, where these underage children are subjected to pornographic material. And it's like, well, why does your 8-year-old kid have a Instagram account? Or why does your 8-year-old kid have a Facebook? I mean, where's the parental responsibility in that situation? I'm not saying I think Mark Zuckerberg doesn't have any responsibility, but at the same time, like, where is the parents' responsibility? It's interesting because just recently, the Kids Online Safety Act, KOSA, got a markup, moved out of committee. Like, it's a bipartisan piece of legislation. And the funny thing is, the main thing it does is just say, we're going to finally enforce the rules, which is that you have to be 13 years old in order to get a social media account. And the companies are required to find a way to verify that. So up until now, the reason I think there is a fair amount of blame to be placed on these social media companies is that they knew they were perfectly happy, and they in some ways encouraged young underage people coming on their sites, using them because they stayed, right? And that's good for them. They stayed. And they've always had ways to do verification, age verification. It's possible. Will some kids get around it? Of course, they always do. But some kids go, get a fake ID and buy alcohol when they're underage. We punish that. But you know what? If you're the liquor store that's selling to underage kids, you lose your liquor license. When it comes to social media platforms, our attitude has been very blasé. It's been like, oh, it's all on the parents to monitor. And I do believe it starts at home. It starts with modeling good habits, making sure you're talking to your kids about this stuff and trying to keep an eye on what's going on. But there's a group action problem now that I think is why you see more parents and more school systems saying, you know what, enough. We know this is harmful. They know it's harmful. Now, it required whistleblowers in the case of Facebook for this data to be revealed, as they knew the harms to kids. They know kids are on their platform. So they have some responsibility too. And in that sense, It kind of reminds me of the debate over secondhand smoking in public places, where people were like, you know what, you can choose to smoke, you know, you might get lung cancer. But if you're smoking around people who don't have a choice and who it's harming and they're kids, you know, we're going to make some rules about that. And so that's where, and I fight with my libertarian friends about this all the time, but I'm like, there is a role for government sometimes to come in and say, you know what, this is harmful. We know it's harmful. We're going to put some limits on this activity. That said, ultimately, it's really in the hands of the adults. We are just as complicit by using this stuff in ways that undermine civility, that undermine patience, that model behavior for younger people, that it's totally normal if you're waiting for a minute to be scrolling through your phone, even at a stop sign in the car, to be constantly on these phones. They see that and they think it's normal because it is normal. So we do have personal responsibility there, and that's, you can't legislate personal responsibility. That's where libertarian instincts are probably right. But what you can do is start talking about the choices we're making and talking about ways of repairing the things that we don't want the technology to mediate, whether that's a family meal, put your phones away. That's the rule in my house. You can't have your phone if you're over at our house for dinner. If it means going to a concert and, you know, not filming the whole thing, or, and I hate this term, raw dogging. This is why you see these trends, like the guys who go on the airplane, no entertainment. They just sit for the whole flight and have no entertainment. That's pretty hardcore, but like, that's why people are trying this. They understand that it's too much. So we have to start talking about more honestly placing limits on ourselves with these tools. And it's hard to do, but it is possible.
What's going to be like the next 10 years look specifically for Gen Z? I think the bottom line is everyone wants to talk about AI and all the technological advancement. Like, you know, like this stuff is not going to progress as fast as people think it is. As we mentioned before, your Chamaths and your Andreessens, they're trying to push the next hype cycle. We're not going to have AI replace nurses, probably not even in our lifetime, let alone the next 10 years. Some jobs on where you're just sitting behind a computer, like if you're, I don't know, like a paralegal or something like that. Yeah, maybe ChatGPT will replace that in the next decade. But a lot of these jobs, AI is not going to replace them. And if anything, it's just going to augment it. You still have to have a brain. You still have to figure out when AI is hallucinating and things like that. If Gen Z is just going to have zero skills whatsoever and think technology is going to do everything for them, they're going to be unhireable. And then that, of course, creates all other problems. So what are you going to do if you're unemployed, living at your parents' house? You're just going to be some activist out there causing chaos, not actually contributing to society, and being a net negative instead of a net positive or neutral. And I think that's the whole thing too with the gender affirming care and things like that. I mean, they say a lot of these kids are autistic and whatever, and you're like, what are these people going to do in 10 years when they've already had a mastectomy or double mastectomy or whatever?
Change their mind, which the majority do. Yeah.
Right, which changes it. Like these people are going to be absolutely burdens on society, if not financially, psychologically, and I mean, could you blame them? I mean, I don't. Especially they've been sold this false bill of goods by people that should be protecting them.
Right. Well, that is the challenge for the next generation, which is to recognize first, to better understand human nature, which doesn't change that much. So they need to read more history. I'm a historian by training, so I'm always telling people to read more history books. But to recognize that a lot of these challenges, certainly the moral challenges, we face similar challenges before. We haven't always made the right decisions with regard to them, but we do need to understand the power of human nature, even with these new tools. And I think our experience with social media has been a very good warning when we start thinking about the promises made for AI, because what we learned from social media is that at the beginning, everyone's like, this is amazing. I mean, some of us were naysayers early on, but nobody listened to us. But they're like, this is amazing. It's going to bring us together. We're going to understand each other better as humans because we'll have all this access to information. We'll connect, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, it didn't really turn out that way. It hasn't really been good for, say, our politics or our culture. It has had some beneficial effects, but the unintended negative consequences have far outweighed the positive. In my opinion, people argue about that. But when we think about AI, it's going to be the same thing. And you know why? Because what is the common denominator? Human beings. Our efforts should be really, really invested in figuring out what makes us all be better human beings to each other. And the one thing we do know from experience in history and social science research is that from a very young age, it helps to be around other people, learn how to interact with them, learn how to resolve conflict with them in person when you're little, so that when you're bigger and you have to resolve conflict, you have a whole toolbox at your disposal because you've practiced. And, whether you're a parent or you're just a member of that same generation, recognizing the stubborn nature of what it means to be human. And then instead of buying into the line sold by tech that they'll alter that or extend our senses and make all these promises. No. Be skeptical of those promises and say, you know what? Humans have kind of done the same thing over and over again. We tend to react with fear, anger, anxiety, and we, that gets our attention. So how do we behave better with these tools rather than expecting the tools to make us better?
Christine Rosen, author of the new book, The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World, was our guest today. Just two questions for you, Christine. Just first, where can people find you, get a hold of your book, that information? And then secondly, leave us with a final thought related to your book or whatever is on your mind.
Well, it's sold wherever books are sold. I always encourage people to go to their local independent bookstore. I have a couple really great ones here. So you can go to bookshop.org, but it's also on all the major purveyors online. And let's see, a final thought. If I could do anything to encourage people, it would be to throughout the day, for one day, try not pulling your phone out and looking at it when you're just have an interstitial moment, when you're just waiting for something, in between time, and let your mind wander and see where it goes.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.